Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Holthe, with my co-host, Alicia Backman-Beharry. How are you doing today, Alicia?
I am doing well, Mark. It is one of those beautiful spring days in Alberta, and it is good to be alive in those beautiful spring days in Alberta. But we thought we would look today at things that are probably top of mind for most immigrants when they are trying to decide whether they want to move and bring their life to Canada and try to submit that PR application. And the question is, what is the real cost of immigrating to Canada?
Yeah. And I think lots of people never factor it in. Often the one question they ask us, how much do you charge as immigration lawyers to work with us and help us submit our application? So we've got our fees and they're all laid out on our website. But what very few people talk about is the actual real costs. And we're talking hard costs and soft costs. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But what we thought we'd do is just share a quick little overview of, we went through and we looked at all of the basic costs, and you may have others that we haven't thought of, but we want to go through a rundown of the hard costs. So this is in addition to any legal fees or representative fees that you might pay. And this is inclusive of not just the immigration application fees, but the other things that you need to do and take care of and present to immigration that have a cost associated with them. So right off the bat, Alicia, we have our government fees. So why don't you break down those for our listeners?
And this is a timely podcast today, Mark, because if you don't really follow the world of Canadian immigration super carefully, you may not have noticed that as of April 30th this year, 2024, the Canadian government has increased the amount of fees. So two things: proof of funds they've increased, but also there are actually hard costs on the application fees that people need to submit. So keep in mind that when you are considering if you're coming under a federal skilled worker class application, these proof of fund requirements have changed. So in addition to actually expending all this amount of money for your application, you also have to keep this safe amount of fees in your bank account. But when we look at the government fees for express entry, those increased as of April 30th. So it used to be, 1,300 something or other, and now it's 1,525 per applicant. So these figures are all current and accurate as of today, which is we're in May. But keep in mind, if you're looking at old things on the internet, they might have the old fees. So those fees, again, April 30th, 2024 was everything when everything rolled over. So per applicant, there's a 1,525 government fee that has to be paid in Canadian dollars per adult applicant. So we're going to do a little test case of a family of three: mom, dad, and a child. So each principal applicant, well, the principal applicant and each adult applicant has to pay the 1,525, and dependent children are going to be 260. So that fee is up from it used to be 230. And the way that they break it down is theoretically you could just pay the application fee separate from your right of permanent residence fee, right of landing fee, but usually that just slows down the application. So we've lumped them together in that $1,525 figure.
And the
In
reason
addition,
Alicia and the reason that Alicia says it slows it down is because if you only pay the application fee, just the application, and like we have here listed, if you're watching on YouTube, the right of permanent residence fee is a second portion in addition to the application fee, and we just have them lumped together as 1525. But if you were just to pay the application fee, and some people say, well, I want to kind of reserve this money for some other purposes, I need to pay my language assessment and all these other things, and so when you're filing your application, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to delay, because like Alicia said, once they reach the stage where they're ready to finalize, then they have to ask you for that right of landing fee. And if you haven't paid it in advance, it can delay your application up to a month or even longer to finalize it. And most of you, we know, are very anxious to get this done quick. So we always recommend that you pay it upfront.
mhm. So yeah, if you did want to split them, the application fee or the processing fee is 950, and then the right of permanent residence landing fee is another 575. So we would usually recommend that people combine that, pay that rate up front when they're submitting their EAPR. And then biometrics per individual. So this is where people have to go and do digital fingerprinting. That is $85 per person. If you have a family of 2 people or more, they just charge you a family fee of $170. And keep in mind, biometrics are done separately. So that's not, unless you've already come to Canada in the past 10 years and have done biometrics, normally you will have to wait for your biometrics instruction letter, and then you'll go out and do that after you've submitted your application.
All
So
right.
language tests, yeah, these are part of an express entry application that are essential. So if you want to create a valid profile, you have to have a valid language test. And we just picked IELTS as an example, but there are other tests for English, CELPIP and Pearson. And of course, for French, there's the TCF and the TEF. And we're just ballpark figuring that most of those tests, by the time you get the test result, and you sometimes there's fees for getting transcripts and sealed envelopes and courier fees, it's probably going to be around about $300 Canadian per IELTS test or language test that you need. So if you need 2 language tests, right, if you're the principal applicant and your spouse is also claiming points for language, you'll actually need 2 of those tests.
Or if you're vying for one of those coveted francophone category-based draws or those extra points, then
Mhm.
roughly another 300 per test. So
That's right. Yeah. So for education credential assessments, unless you've actually completed your highest level of education in Canada, you also have to have an education credential assessment. And there are a number of organizations that do education credential assessments. So we just picked WES as an example, but there's ICAS, IQAS, there's other language education credential assessment organizations that they will accept. So make sure you're looking at which ones IRCC accepts. And again, it's going to vary by institution, but it's probably looking to be about Canadian $300 per education credential that you need. So again, if husband and wife both have education that they want to put into their profile, then you'll need to have 2 of these education credential assessments.
next on our list is medical examinations, which up front, you may not require a medical exam for purposes of express entry right now, but during the course of processing, everyone will be required to complete a medical examination. And so for a family of 3 here, Alicia, what do we have for costs?
Yeah, and again, this is going to depend on the panel physician. So remember, again, immigration doesn't just let any sort of medical exam be approved. It has to be through a designated panel physician. And so make sure that you're booking with one of the doctors that is on the list with IRCC, and it's going to depend upon the physician. So we looked at it, some of them have sliding scales depending on your age, but probably for adults, it's about around $200 Canadian, and for kids, it's probably a little bit less, maybe $160 Canadian.
Yep. And then next we have police clearance certificates, which everyone is required to obtain a police clearance certificate for every country they've lived in for 6 months in a row since turning 18 years of age. So it could be more than one country, but in this case where we for one individual we assume maybe for 2 countries maybe it costs $50. Like some countries may not charge. I don't know. It just depends. But roughly we kind of factor in about $25 maybe per country, and might be less, might be a little bit more. And for the principal applicant, if there were 2 countries that we needed to obtain the certificates from, remember, you do not need to provide it from Canada unless specifically asked. It's about $50 Canadian for the principal applicant and the spouse. And so from just the basic kind of things that most people will require, and really I should say all people will require, all of those fees are areas that you're going to be spending extra money. But in addition to these, Alicia, there are even more potential um, costs of immigrating to Canada that people don't factor in initially. So let's dive into these other real costs. And one is translation of documents.
Yeah. And this is also where a lot of express entry applications go wrong or get refused. If people have not provided their original language document plus that properly translated document, and usually there's a certified translation process, the translator has to have that proper attestation, and usually they have a copy of what they were translating. So be very careful with translations, but also keep in mind that translators' fees vary. So if you have a number of documents, marriage certificates, and you've got um, school records and other things that need to be translated, bank records, that's a big one, or proof of title, property documents,
Yeah.
those ones can get extremely pricey because normally translators charge either per word or per page, and that can
Yeah.
be 10 cents to 30 cents per word, or there's sliding scale for pages. So budget this in.
Yeah, and shop around. Like there are a lot of different translators all over. And I'll be honest, IRCC doesn't care as long as they're a certified translator and
Mhm.
they're a professional translator. You can shop around and find the place that will give you the best deal. And like Alicia said, when you are especially proof of funds, when you're looking at transcribing bank statements and things like that, it can become really, really prohibitive from a cost standpoint. So definitely shop around. Okay,
Mhm.
travel costs. You have to, if you're not in Canada already, you have to travel. So
Mhm.
this obviously varies, Alicia.
Absolutely. And most, I mean, we have a number of American clients, and our neighbors to the south are sometimes coming up to Canada and settling here permanently. But by and large, most people probably have to get on an airplane in order to get to Canada. And so fees are probably going to be at least $1,300 per person. So if we're looking at a family of three, we're at $3,900 just to get to Canada if your application is approved.
Yeah, and you think about it, sometimes we can travel really light and we do our very best to not have check bags because they're now charging, enormous amounts for check bags. And when you're traveling with your family and you're immigrating permanently to Canada, more often than not, you're both are going to have at least two check bags. And so that can even increase these fees. And we just did a little search for a one-way flight from India to Canada right now. And the average was around $1,300. I'm sure you can find cheaper flights, or maybe it'll be more expensive for the area you're coming from, but that's kind of on average. So we're just doing this just as a very, very bare guideline for you, because once we get to the summary of total costs, that's where you're really going to like this. So hang in there. We got a few more things we want to point out.
And
Okay.
just like,
Yeah.
yeah, Mark showed us at the beginning, those settlement funds. And so this is where, as of May 27th, so 2 days ago, immigration has said, wait a minute, you've got to go back into your Express Entry profile and update how much you have in accessible funds in order to settle in Canada. And so for a family of three, this figure is now 22,483. Keep in mind, this is not a hard cost that you have to expend, but you have to keep it as that safe money in your bank account, and it must be accessible. So this is something that you've got to prove when you're doing your express entry in terms of your proof of funds.
Yeah. Okay. Let's finish this hard cost assessment with total costs. So if you look
Hmm.
here, when we add all of this up, Alicia, for a family of three, we're looking at about $3,480 in IRCC processing fees, just the government fees. And then when we factor in all of these additional costs, which people rarely take into consideration, you can see as it adds up, it totals 6,210 for a total cost estimate based on, this obviously will go up and down, almost $10,000,
Hmm.
9,690 for a family of three. So obviously if there's excuse me, you can do the math. And if there are, there's more, you have more dependent children, or you're single, you can look at this and you can do your own kind of calculations. But it is not insignificant. These costs really do add up.
Hmm. So those are the hard costs, and we thought it was important to highlight this for a couple of reasons. One is that the government processing fees just went up last month, and the settlement fees just went up a couple days ago. And so both of those things are real factors that people need to be aware of and to update in their profiles and to be ready to pay when they go to submit their application. Otherwise, there's a risk that they are not going to be able to complete their express entry application. So this is timely. This is something that pay attention to the details, right? Make sure that you are tracking this carefully and updating your profile if needed, because we are looking at a dearth of draws, right? We've not had an express entry invitation or round of invitations since the end of April. So make sure that you go into your profile, you update it, you transmit it if that's something that you've not done yet, so that you have those updated proof of settlement funds, for example. And Mark, maybe we'll also just briefly touch on, in addition to those hard costs, there are also real soft costs involved in uprooting your life and coming to a new country.
Yes, indeed. And I'll pull all four up. And when we're talking about these, we could have a whole different podcast to just discuss the soft costs of, what it really costs you to move to Canada from a non financial standpoint. And when you look at this, we'll just hit on these very, very quickly because, like I said, there isn't a lot of time to really dive into these. And it really varies by person, and it varies from the country you're coming from. And the adjustment moving to Canada will really be dependent upon you. It's really personal, but these are things that you should really look at. So when we start off with social costs, the obvious one is the cost of leaving behind a community and integrating into a new one. There's impacts on children, family dynamics during this kind of a transition, and it's something that plays a big role, and you have to be prepared for that. So yeah, the challenges just of just trying to integrate into a new community. And for some people, maybe you'll have a very, very large ethnic community that you're moving to where it will just seem almost like home, but you're in Canada. We're a very multicultural country. And so there's lots of communities that really retain a lot of their, their community and ethnic identities. And so you don't feel that transition as much. But for others, you may move to rural Alberta, where maybe there isn't anyone else that's from your country, and there really is, it can be a little bit challenging. So those social costs are a reality. Then there's the psychological costs, and Alicia, maybe if you want to address those.
Mm-hmm. And immigration's a bit of a emotional roller coaster, right? People are kind of putting their life on hold, trying to figure out, am I going to get an invitation to apply? When's the next round of invitations? If they're here working in Canada and they're about to lose their status, they're trying to figure out, what do I do with my life? Do I have to go back home? If you're not inside of Canada and you're getting older, right, and you're worried whether you will have a chance to come to Canada. So there's psychological aspects of immigration that cause people to think twice sometimes about immigrating, or once they're in, they feel like, okay, they're committed, right? They can't really get out because now they've put out other things on hold. So psychological costs are real. There's emotional tolls of going through the immigration process and coming to Canada, right? And so one of the nice things that the Government of Canada has done, IRCC, has pre-arrival settlement services. And so some of you who are going through an economic application or sometimes a sponsorship application will get these emails from immigration saying, you are now eligible for pre-arrival settlement services if you are outside of Canada only. And that's a nice way. Take advantage of that. Make sure to use that because those settlement services should help the transition.
Yes. And I think that the third one on our list is opportunity costs. And for most people who are immigrating to Canada as an economic immigrant, you're thinking about this stuff. And that's the potential career disruption for a principal applicant and a spouse, and basically evaluating the long-term career prospects in Canada versus staying in your home country. And those who are qualifying through express entry, you guys often have very successful careers. You have at least 3 years of foreign work experience when you're looking to immigrate to Canada, and you may be very well established in your country. And as you look to transition to Canada, are those same opportunities that you benefit from in your home country, will they be there in Canada? There's many professions are regulated. There's a lot of challenges when it comes to getting your foreign work experience acknowledged and accepted by Canadian companies. And often people come and they have to start a survival job, and in many instances rebuild their lives in Canada, right from scratch, starting right over. And a lot of people don't always think about that. Now, in some cases, when you come and study in Canada and you then get a job in Canada, this type of an opportunity cost just isn't a factor because you're already building and starting from the bottom and building your career already domestically in Canada. So there isn't that transition because your career prospects haven't even started in your home country. But that is definitely something that people factor in. And then
Mm-hmm.
the last one, Alicia. Yeah.
Yeah, and that leads to educational adjustments. And I've volunteered with various settlement organizations for years in Calgary. And one of the things that we see, or I've heard over and over again from immigrants, is the parents will come and they will work 2 or 3 jobs and they will just grind their knuckles to the bone in order to try to sacrifice for their kids so that their kids have an opportunity in Canada. And unfortunately, sometimes that means those kids don't see their parents. And so sometimes the kids run into, emotional difficulty, educational difficulty. Maybe they're not doing so well with school. Sometimes the kids learn English or French very efficiently, effectively, but the parents are still struggling. And so the kids become the interpreters for their parents. So there are educational adjustments that need to be made and family adjustments that need to be made as well. So something to keep in mind in terms of what are your support networks? What are your systems in place so that you as a new immigrant can provide yourself and your family the best chance of successfully coming to Canada and staying in Canada, because that's ultimately the goal, and that's what Canada wants too, is to make sure that people are welcomed into those communities. And not only that Canada is benefiting from immigrants, but immigrants have so much to offer in terms of the breadth and the depth of their knowledge and bringing their skills from wherever they've come from. They have a huge amount of innovation.
Exactly. I was thinking just about my own experience with two little ones when we moved to Winnipeg, which was, a 12-hour drive from Lethbridge here, where I was going to school to do law school. And there were a lot of things that we took for granted, I guess, here at home with our family, our church community all around us, all these support networks, Sunday dinners going over to family, and when we arrived in Winnipeg and we then, it took a few weeks to realize, wait a minute, our money is not going as far as it did back home because we didn't have those Sunday dinners and, we didn't have family there always helping and being there to watch the kids and things like that. We needed to pay for babysitters and caregivers at times as well. Although my wife is phenomenal, she has always been home and cared for the kids, and I'll love her forever because of that. But there are real adjustments, and when you leave your community and all those social support networks and family support and come to Canada, it can be very isolating and it can be challenging. And Alicia's just touched on briefly the challenge for kids when both parents are working really hard to get a future set up for their children. And in many instances, families move because they want a better life for their children. Sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. And so definitely there's things to consider and to plan for well in advance, so that you're prepared for these things and know that they are going to come. So there we have it, Alicia. These are the real costs of immigrating to Canada, both the hard costs and the soft costs. We hope that you found this beneficial. Once again, we'll reiterate that the total of almost $10,000 in addition to, basically the hard costs is an estimate, and that will change, and it'll vary upon your personal circumstances, but that's kind of what we calculated for a family of three. And hopefully this gives you now a little bit more of an idea what to expect as you enter into this process. Our firm, Holthe Immigration Law, people have told us repeatedly, we didn't know that the Canadian Immigration Institute was associated with Holthe Immigration Law, and that you guys had a firm and that you worked with people and represented. I don't know how, but people do. Maybe they don't stick around and listen to the very end of the podcast, but we're here to support you and help you in any way. We very much appreciate any referrals and any work that comes our way. We love doing what we do, and that's why we do the podcast. But first and foremost, this is educational. It's here to help you guys, support you and because there's just so much misinformation out there. There's so many individuals seeking to exploit and take advantage, and it's a sad part of our industry, Alicia. But we're here to try to help and educate and empower people so that they can make good decisions. So if you need any assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to us with your express entry application or any application. And you can find us at holthelaw.com. And also those of you who are watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And those who are listening on iTunes or Spotify or Google Play or wherever you're listening to your podcasts, we love to hear from you. Love to hear ideas of topics that you'd like us to cover. And Yeah. And now Alicia and I, as always, when we record this, we follow it up with a live Q&A on YouTube. So we're heading over there in just a minute. We're actually a little bit behind, so people are wondering probably where we are. So we'll end this podcast here. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks to our sponsor, which is the 2024 Express Entry Accelerator DIY course that I've created. You can find that on the Canadian Immigration Institute website. All right, guys, take care. Thanks so much, Alicia.